Hello and welcome. I'm Dana Bibi of the programs team at the Columbia Global Center in Amman. Thank you for joining us today for a reading and conversation with Layla AlAmmar. We are delighted to bring you a discussion of both her debut novel, Pact We Made, and her very recently released book, Silence is a Sense. Layla AlAmmar is a writer and academic from Kuwait with a master's in creative writing from the University of Edinburgh. She is currently pursuing a PhD at Lancaster University, researching Arab women's fiction as archives of traumatic memory. She has written for The Guardian and Arab Lit Quarterly. Layla's debut novel, The Pact We Made, was longlisted for the Authors Club First Novel Award and nominated for the First Book Award at the Edinburgh International Book Festival. Her second novel, Silence is a Sense, was published a few weeks ago in March to great positive acclaim. Layla's writing has been characterized by reviewers as intelligent and insightful, evocative, and extraordinarily powerful. Her work is recognized as being full of personality, passion, and touches of humor. A New York Times review notes that in experimenting so freely with tone and form, Layla models how to relinquish tight narrative control for the sake of following language to its own organic ends. We will be sharing the links for the books in the chat box below, and we are pleased to be involved and to have the opportunity to share this work with a broader audience. The global centers are hubs of Columbia University, currently in 9 cities around the world, that work with students, faculty, and regional partners to create opportunities for shared learning and research, and to deepen the nature of global dialogue on a range of issues. This book talk is the second in a series that features Arab authors to showcase some of the breadth and diversity in Arab fiction writing. Both of Layla's books are deeply impactful. The Pact We Made wraps elegantly the notions of secrets, family, and the agency of a woman navigating a complex and contradictory life in Kuwait. In Silence is a Sense, memory, revolution, loss, and safety intertwine in a fierce and fascinating story of a refugee's trauma and escape from the Syrian civil war. Both of Layla's novels are set in the present day, and this allows both to resonate uniquely with unforgettable, nuanced narratives of women. I would now like to hand over to Dr. Shahd Alshammari, our moderator for this conversation. Dr. Shahd is an assistant professor of literature at Gulf University for Science and Technology in Kuwait. Her research interests include madness in literature, disability studies, and illness narratives. She is the author of Notes on the Flesh and will be releasing her memoir in 2022 with Neem Tree Press. Thank you again to everyone in our virtual audience for being with us. Please do send in your questions through the Q&A chat box at the bottom of your screen, and they will be addressed in the latter half of this webinar. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Shahd.
Thank you, Dana. Thank you very much. Thank you for that lovely introduction, and to the Center for offering such a platform. I'm really excited to be talking to Layla today about a lot of stuff, actually. We've got a lot of questions. A lot of my students are actually in the audience. We're very happy to be speaking to Layla, and I'm sure we have time for all of your questions at the end. First things first, I have my copy of The Pact We Made, and as an author myself, I love showcasing book covers, and Layla has hers too. I always think it's really important to, get the feeling of the book out there. We do have the links in the chat, but it's nice to kind of hold the book. I've read Layla's books, and I'm in the process of teaching them too in the future, and I think there's a lot there that can be up for discussion. But more than anything, I want to start with a big question, Layla, that everybody asks all the time, and I'm sure you have an answer for it because we get asked this all the time. As an Arab author, why write in English? What is that, like a betrayal? Can you rationalize that? Do you have a reasoning for it? And we need to kind of come up with an answer at this point. So I'll leave it to you.
Yeah, first of all, thank you to Shahd for agreeing to participate in this, and to Columbia Global Centers for hosting, and everybody in the audience for attending, of course. Yeah, I constantly get asked this question, and it's a question that I think all Arab writers who write in English will eventually get asked at one point. The first thing I always do is I interrogate the question itself. And so I wonder the degree to which it is actually a choice to write in English. I was thinking about that earlier today, and I was thinking, I couldn't think of a single Arab writer who is equally proficient in both languages, which is not to say that they don't write in both languages. They do. But I think when it comes to creative expression, one language will naturally fit more than the other language. I think of Hadaf Suwaif, who's written many pieces in Arabic, but to my knowledge, all of her creative fiction is in English. And so I wonder the degree to which we're actually choosing the language. I think to a large part, the language you write in is driven by the language you read in, or what literature you were exposed to during your most formative years, and I always say that reading is the fuel for the writing engine, and I mean that quite literally, that the books you read, the language that you read in, all of this is naturally going to fuel your own literary output. And so if you grew up reading British or American literature, then when you try your hand at writing a story, that's probably what you're going to feel most comfortable in. That being said, it doesn't absolve the writer of the consequences of that language. And so you need to be aware that when you're writing Arab literature in English, you are entering a conversation that has been happening and a debate that has been happening for decades. And I think that writers need to be aware and responsible and cognizant of that dialogue that's happening. And, principally what it comes down to, which is what the question of literature a lot of times comes down to, is who is the audience, right? So what is the reception environment? If you're writing in Arabic, it's an Arabic audience, and you're speaking local and regional issues to a local and regional audience. So you're keeping it in the house, as it were, right? You're speaking to one another. You're speaking to your people. Yeah. And that's always been seen as a very clear-cut dynamic or clear-cut process. When you're writing in English, the situation is completely different, and it takes on many more layers of complexity, because the idea is that you're writing in English, so you're writing for an English-speaking, quote unquote, Western audience. And I use the quotes because it's an outdated term. But that's what the idea is that suddenly you're entering into dialogue with a foreign environment, with a foreign reception environment. And so you take on this role of being a representative, of being a cultural translator, a mediator. You're no longer speaking inside your house, you're speaking out. And then this brings up the question of, are you an advocate for your community? Are you representing them properly, whatever that means? Or are you a traitor and you're betraying your community by, airing the dirty laundry or talking about issues that they don't want people talking about? You know what I mean? So it becomes much more complex in terms of who are you talking to, and all of that can be a very taxing and burdensome process, because you're sitting here thinking, well, I'm just writing a book, but suddenly you're constantly pivoting to these different frameworks that are coming at you from all of these different directions, and I don't think that it's as clear cut as it was 30 or 40 years ago. I don't think that Western audience exists in the way that we think of them. English speaking readers, it's a huge, wide demographic. The people who are reading Arab Anglophone literature now are bilingual Arabs or English speaking Arabs, Arabs in the diaspora, Arabs in our region, immigrant communities in our region and outside of our region, quote unquote Western readers who are familiar with our region and who are familiar with the cultural milieu and the society. So, this idea that it's a simple dichotomy, I don't think it exists any longer. And I think that we need to move beyond that. but it's something that we have to be aware of at the end of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I started with this question because it's the question that comes up, by academics, by students of literature. Everybody asks this question.
And you get criticized for it.
Yeah, and it's that burden that you mentioned. You have to basically speak up and speak against it and speak for it. And it's just, you're just a writer writing it in whatever medium you choose to write in. But anyway, based on that answer, I'll just jump right into the pact we made. So the pact we made has a lot of Kuwaiti dialect in it, and there's a lot of words that to quote unquote the Western reader just don't make sense. And I don't believe there is a footnote or a glossary anywhere. So maybe could you talk about that and the reasoning behind it?
Yeah, I do. I use unglossed Arabic in my novels, and as you say, in the Pact We Made, it was Kuwaiti dialect. So there isn't a glossary, but occasionally there would be some contextualization which would clarify. And I do that because the Kuwaiti dialect is not a common dialect in the region. Like it's not like Egyptian or Lebanese where other people understand it, because it's what we hear in our music and see on film and TV, and so we're all familiar with these accents. The Kuwaiti accent is a little bit different, or the dialect is. But Silence is a Sense also has a lot of unglossed Arabic as well as Arabic text. And I do that quite deliberately. Because it feels organic to have Arabic idioms and phrases and terms that I think can't be translated in the way that I want them to and retain their essence. So I have to keep them in Arabic. But the larger reason I do it is as a gesture of inclusion. It's a gesture to bilingual readers that, hey, this book is for you too. It's not just for people who are English speaking or monolingual only. It's for you as well. And it's because that I myself, when I was reading books by Ahdaf Swaif or Suzanne Abul Hawa, and I would come to the glossary, I'd be like, oh, and I get a feeling like this book isn't actually for you, it's for someone else. And I do feel excluded a little bit, and that's above and beyond the maybe unnecessary exposition or explaining of context and history that sometimes happens to kind of smooth it for a Western audience. But I choose to have unglossed Arabic because I want Arabic speakers to see it and think, oh, this book is actually talking to me. And even if in doing that, it excludes an English only reader for a moment, or jars them or subordinates them for a moment, it's fine. Like it's okay. I want that gesture to be there.
Yeah. It definitely comes up a lot in critical theory, the idea of alienating the reader. Authors do this on purpose. So when I read your book, I was very pleased to see the words were not translated. And like, for example, Yathum, it comes up all the time in the book, and there's no actual explanation for that, but it makes sense that it is Yathum, that there's no other translation for it. So it's a choice.
And I think it's fine for a reader to be jarred. I mean, I'm constantly jarred in the literature that I read, and I think that there's a productive energy to being momentarily displaced or alienated from the text, to feel like you're not the primary subject in this process. That there is an other that has primacy in that moment. And I think that that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that dynamic or with feeling that way.
Speaking of alienating readers and making others feel included, how was I'll start with the Pact We Made, but also I guess Silence is a Sense. How were they both received by a local audience that are familiar with Yathum and the Kuwaiti setting, and then a more, let's say, Western audience? The book was I think there's a quote. It's a Kuwaiti Me Too novel, and that just stands out for me. So maybe we could talk a bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't like labels, so I wasn't super pleased with the Me Too label because, and it's not to say that it doesn't have resonances with that movement. This idea of unacknowledged trauma is an important one, but labels are, to me, very restrictive and very limiting, and they immediately put preconceptions in the reader's mind, and then the reader will immediately go into the text expecting certain things, and kind of almost measuring or grading the text against those expectations. I prefer that readers don't go in with those ideas, those prefixed ideas. But you can't escape these things. They have to happen. But in terms of the reception for the book, I think on both ends, it's always that same thing. When you're a writer from a marginalized background, a woman writer as well from a marginalized background, your fiction is always going to be read in a certain way in a Western reception environment. So, in Europe or in the States, it tends to be seen for its ethnographic value as revealing something, or as unveiling or educating or informing. It serves a kind of almost pedagogical function, and so the issues that tend to be highlighted are political ones, ideological issues, encounters with the West. So you tend to get, you tend to get them foregrounding the encounter, even if the encounter is not a huge part of the novel, but suddenly that's what it's about. So like with Silence in a sense, for example, it would be like the British immigration policy, or the asylum process, things of that nature. Whereas people from our part of the world, or people who are familiar with the regional context, they tend to look at it through the prism of the Arab Spring, of the decade of uprisings that we had, understanding the nuances of how these uprisings rose and failed in different contexts. And, we understand the specific differences between Syria and Egypt. These are not the same thing, and we understand those complexities. So those tend to come up. People familiar with the context also will focus more individually on her trauma and her struggles with memory, and the role those two things play in her identity and her very specific personhood, and the intersectionality of her personhood, rather than, her function as a refugee, or her function as this, you know what I mean? Or Dalia in the Pact We Made, her function as a modern Kuwaiti woman, you know what I mean? So they tend to kind of dig more into the specificities of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it really becomes the idea of who gets to speak, and what is actually being said in the two novels. So, having read both of them, one question comes up for me. The book, The Pact We Made, the first book, was about a Kuwaiti modern woman, so to speak, and she's struggling with contemporary issues, and she's trying to, face society and make her way through. And then Silence is a Sense is about a Syrian refugee, and it's like a completely different book by a completely different author. And I mean, both are beautiful, and I love both equally. But I'm just wondering about that shift, so a bit more from the local to the Syrian. So it seems a bit different to me, and it raises a lot of questions. One of the first questions was: is Layla AlAmmar, the Kuwaiti writer, writing about a Syrian refugee? So it raises questions of who gets to speak, ethics, the ethics of representation. So I was hoping you could talk about that, because that's a whole big, can of worms, and I think there's a lot you have to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, we could almost have an entire session
just who gets to speak. So,
I mean, there's a lot of ways that you can approach this this question of who gets to speak, and the idea of a Kuwaiti writing about a Syrian experience, or a non-refugee writing about a refugee experience. It's like, where do you draw the line of, well, you can write about this, but you can't write about that. And I think a lot of this has to do with, there was a movement that kind of swept through predominantly YA literature over in America the last few years about diversity in publishing, and it was own voices, and it was this hashtag own voices movement that was happening, which is obviously necessary, right? We all, nobody can argue with the idea that we do need own voices, and we need more diverse titles and more diverse writers. But somehow along the way, this movement became conflated with own stories. And we started to see a collapsing of the distinction, where it wasn't just talking about your own voices, which, is kind of a murky idea anyway. Like, what do we mean? Who is this voice? Who gets to be, the Latina own voices, or the Arab own voices? What does that even mean, right? We kind of ignored that, and it became own stories, which is more simplified. So it's this idea that in order to write something, you have to have personal experience of that thing. And it has to be something that you yourself went through, right? And this has generated a lot of controversies. And we saw, American Dirt with Janine Cummings, who, was writing about a Mexican immigrant experience, even though she's not Mexican, and it caused this big furor over in the States. And then we had My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell, where, the Twitter storm got so bad that she had to actually prove or make a statement saying that she had actually endured the trauma that she wrote about in her novel. This is brand new. Like, this is something that has never happened before. The function of a novelist, like, their role is to create worlds and to create characters who inhabit those worlds. And it's not really anyone's place to put restrictions or impositions on what that process should look like. Right. You're certainly free to criticize it, but we can't get into a place where we kind of pressure novelists to expose their own traumas in order to prove that they are allowed to write about it. You know what I mean? That's
it happens with nonfiction a lot, but I'm surprised about the fiction. The nonfiction, I can see it happening, but
I could see it happening as well for nonfiction, because that's the nature of the beast, right? Or sometimes we see it with memoirs or autobiographies, where it suddenly turns out that it was all fake, or parts of it were made up. I can see that being a legitimate criticism, but fiction is made up. That's the nature of it, so at what point do you stop policing that process of well, you can write about these topics, but you can't write about that, and you need to authenticate
everything.
Or like provide evidence that you've been through this trauma in order to write about it. I think the whole thing is a little unreasonable, to be honest.
But I think the distinction to make here is, I can write about it, but I'm still going to do my research about it.
Oh, yeah.
And I think you mentioned that in Silence is a Sense a bit towards the end. So I was hoping you could talk about that research process, because reading the book, it felt pretty much like you've done your research. It didn't feel like this was just completely, bits and pieces from news. That it didn't feel like that. So I was hoping you could, elaborate on that.
Yeah, everything that I said before, that doesn't negate that a writer should feel a responsibility to tell a story as ethically and respectfully as they possibly can. That's a given. I think no matter what project you're pursuing, in terms of your fiction, you should try and go about it as honestly and ethically as possible. So, for Silence is a Sense, this novel was really born out of issues and problems and topics that I had been immersed in and obsessively following for the better part of 10 years. So from the time that the Arab Spring began, which I was living in Kuwait at the time, up until present day, these were issues and topics that I was following constantly. So I was constantly reading articles, reading books, watching documentaries, reading interviews, testimonials, just, anything I could get my hands on, because these issues were troubling me. And it was an anxiety that was constantly on my mind. And so when this voice came to me, all of that reading and listening and watching that I if kind of funneled its way into this story. Yeah. And, in the process of writing it, I would go and double check things, if there were certain dates or certain events that I couldn't remember when it actually happened, I would go back and research it. Reading refugee testimonials and reports and seeing interviews and things like that was all important as well in the process. But it was really, it almost felt like a natural end, not even an end, because I'm still kind of caught up in it, but like a natural result of all of that reading. It had to go somewhere.
Go somewhere. Yeah.
Somewhere. And it was, and writing for me has always been about that. It's been about getting the thing out of me and putting it somewhere, Yeah.
I mean, I think now that we've brought up Silence is a Sense and, how it's a heavy read. It's definitely not a light read at all. And there's so much there in it, but I'd love if you read maybe something from it so that we could contextualize a bit more and hopefully people can get their copy.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so the reading that I'm going to do is from later in the novel. And it's a scene that the protagonist revisits compulsively throughout the narrative. And it's to do with when she was back home in Syria, participating in the protests with her friends, Osama and Amr, and her love interest back home, Khalid. And so there's like a core kernel of trauma and truth there that she can't quite articulate and she can't quite pinpoint or pin down. And so she just circles it. And so this, basically the same scene comes up in the novel 3 times, but in 3 different iterations. So the first time it's pretty straightforward, but a little off, a little surreal. And then the second time it's as though they're puppets in a theater. And then the third time is the one that I'm going to read, which is when the scene kind of takes on a real nightmarish or hellish bent. And it's called The Eye. The cell is limned in red. Hazy, a fine metallic mist hangs in the air, latching itself to the tongue and sliding down a clenched throat. A blood-drop sun pulses in the sky. Its rays burn like acid, like gas, like the chemicals he swears he isn't using. Look around. Everything is red. The aluminum desks, the white tiled floor, the yellow sponge spilling out of the cracks in the leather chairs, it is all bathed in a heavy maroon glow. No matter how hard I scrub, the window pane will not let in anything but red rays. This cell is bordered in oxblood, in burning embers, like a smoldering fire pit. The cell, the word, the concept, looms large in our imagination. Room, house, prison, country, all of themselves. All these places where you are watched and heard and monitored. The only safe space is the one between your ears or in the grave. Usama and Ammar have blood on their faces, and they labor over a fabric that matches. They move their markers over the cotton in silence. Nothing to hear but the scratch as the tip traverses the surface. Painting it in heavy helmeted thugs with stern mouths and tanks crushed by flowers and birds soaring over water wheels. Death before humiliation, death before humiliation, death before humiliation is repeated 100 million times in 100 million ways. We are trying to tell you that there are worse things than dying. High in the corner, the eye watches us. Like every other time and in every other place, it watches us. The veins are more prominent today. Bulging red veins that beat to a soundless rhythm, back and forth, back and forth. No brain behind to interpret what it sees. The huddle is gone this time. It's only Usama and Ammar bent over the desks, me by the windows, and Khalid against the wall. His gaze moving between the eye, the painting of the fabric, and the dead world outside. He's in a beige jumpsuit, a white helmet dangling from his fingertips, and he looks more tired than there are words for. Do you know they call you a liar now, my love? A propagandist? A terrorist, even? Terror. Terror is no longer the 1-2 explosion of barrel bombs, or the pop of gunfire, or the knock on the door. No, we have redefined it. Terror is the silence between explosions, the quiet before the knock on the door, before the bullet hits its target and you can breathe again because this time it wasn't you. We are breathing because outside the bombs have not stopped falling. We inhale one and exhale the other. It's like thunder behind the eyes, like 1,000 drums beating in your chest, like the walls of existence are collapsing all around you all at once. It is like no sound you've heard before. It's done, says Ammar, straightening up and cracking his back. Usama concurs with a nod and answering crack of his neck. Yalla! We, the three of us, roll up the fabric until it's a thick scroll. We carry it to the open windows. I turn to Khalid to ask him to join us, but he's under the eye now, inspecting it, reaching up with hesitant hands to poke at it, as though it might bite, and my breath catches in my lungs. Yalla, Usama says again, prodding me to release my end of the fabric. We let go, and the cotton unfurls down the side of the building. It's met with silence, a silence so complete it seems to have swallowed the world. The banner flaps and slaps against the wall, dripping red and black onto the empty street below. The wind catches it, ripping the fabric from our hands and sending it flying over the buildings. The heavy thugs and tanks detach, inky blobs fall to the pavement without a sound. The flowers burst forth into color and the water wheels and birds go spinning and screaming into the sky. Behind us, there's a crash. Khalid is attacking the eye with his helmet. My heart stops as he hammers at it. Furious, desperate, it drowns out any and all other sounds. Bashing and bashing, he lets out short grunts and yips and what sound like whimpers until the eye cracks and splinters and is ripped from the ceiling to lie in a broken heap at his feet. He's sweaty, jaw locked in a grimace, panting like a feral animal, like the wolf they've turned him into. Is this victory or just another kind of death? Thank you.
Yeah, that's exactly what I meant. It's a pretty heavy passage you selected, and most of the book actually goes back and forth to and revisits the unnamed protagonist's traumas and her memories. And I know that you work academically on trauma, but you also have a lot of both your protagonists in The Pact We Made and Silence is a Sense are dealing with traumas very differently. One uses art as her method of speaking or her method of healing, so to speak. And the unnamed protagonist in Silence is a Sense is silent. She decides to just go mute. She does not speak, but she can hear, of course. And so I was hoping we could talk a bit about your interest in trauma, both academically and then kind of shifting that into fictional characters.
It's actually the other way around. I wrote both novels before I started my doctoral program. So Silence is a Sense, I started writing it in 2017. So that was 2 years before I started my program. So really it's that my scholarly interest grew out of my creative interest. And, I've always been interested in the psychology of trauma and recovery, the different representations of trauma and kind of our popular ideas, our pop psychology, as it were. And to what degree those notions are applicable to our own contexts and the way that we in the Arab world or in Arab literature portray trauma and the way that we express it or transmit it even in the literature. And so, that was something that always came out in my writing. In The Pact We Made, it's a more narrow focus. So it's quite personal trauma that she endures, individual to herself. It's dealing with the unacknowledged nature of it, and these kinds of notions of shame that shackle us when we're not able to speak. Silence is a Sense is much broader. So you do have personal individual trauma that is hers and hers alone, but then you also have this very large scale collective trauma that the Syrian people have endured, which she's a part of. And then you have another collective trauma, which is that of the refugees, which are many different ethnicities and they come from many different backgrounds. So you have these different overlapping personal collective traumas that are happening. Then you also have the personal versus the political, right? And so these will complicate her process of coping, the degree to which she feels able to construct some narrative or some story that will make sense of all of these things that have happened. And so, for the protagonist in Silence is a Sense, initially at least, the response is silence. And the response is that she has now come to a point where language fails and words will not function the way she needs them to. And she cannot even begin to construct a narrative that makes sense. And she tries, because in the narrative, in the novel, she writes for a magazine and she writes articles about her experience as a new immigrant. And so she's not speaking, like she's not vocalizing her experience, but she is trying to communicate it in some way. And there is tension in that relationship between her and Josie, the editor of the magazine. But it's all the same, right? It's all the same thing where she's trying to cope with what's happened and she's trying to construct some sense or make some sense of it. And I think that, the protagonist in Silence is a Sense, it's the nature of these experiences are much more complex and overlapping than they are in the first book, perhaps in The Pact We Made. And so, for Dahlia, she kind of turns to art as a kind of catharsis or as a space of consolation, which, I think the protagonist in Silence is a Sense does as well in her own way, with books and with literature. And I think that art can function in that way, as pseudotherapy, as a space of solace and consolation.
Absolutely. I have a lot of questions, but we've got a lot of questions from the audience, so I'm just going to start asking them. So it says, in The Pact We Made, the theme of saving face comes up frequently. Could you comment on generational changes toward the notion of saving face in Kuwaiti society? I think what she's trying to say is stigma, and I think maybe saving face here means stigma.
Like reputation?
Yeah, I think so. I think saving face, because Dahlia is silent most of the time because of the issue of saving face. She can't
Uh-huh.
speak because of society. So she's asking, or he's asking, or they're asking, could you comment on how that notion has changed maybe in Kuwaiti society?
Yeah, I mean, I think changes are happening, but they're happening maybe slower than we would like them to, or slower than they need to.
Yeah.
There's been a huge shift towards destigmatizing mental health and destigmatizing, the mental health issues that can arise from trauma or abuse, and the stigma that's often attached with that. The feelings of shame, the feelings of guilt. These are all very much built into our society, and
Yeah.
in many ways are inescapable, or they feel that way. They certainly feel that way at times. And so, I think we do have a long way to go. I think that there's still way too much victim blaming that happens in our societies. There's way too much, what was she wearing, or what did she do, or how did she bring it on herself? There's still way too much of that. There's still way too much misogyny in our societies. Yeah, so I think we are making progress, and I think that there are some very brave women who do come out and speak of things that have happened to them, or things that they have witnessed, or they advocate for those victims of domestic abuse, or sexual assault. We need more of that. So I think the change is happening, and I think that things will slowly start to change and get better. But it is very slow sometimes. It feels like it's too slow.
I agree. I agree. It's an interesting question, because again, this notion of saving face is tied to a lot of issues that the Pact We Made does raise. Layla, there's another interesting one, and because I know this kind of also gets asked a lot, but I do want to ask it. How does feminism work in both novels? I would say, especially for the Pact We Made, a lot of readers had a problem with the ending of the Pact We Made. Spoiler alert, but generally.
Don't spoil it.
Go ahead. So feminism in both novels, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't heard any feminist or anti-feminist critique of Silence is a Sense. No one has brought that to my attention, so I don't. I don't really think in an agenda-driven way when I'm writing. I probably think about the audience or the reader less than I should. I think that to some extent it can be good to think about who's going to be reading your books and what they might take away from it. But I find it paralyzing, to be honest. And I think that if I thought too much about what all of these different readers might think, I would never actually write anything,
Or get some sleep,
So yeah, I mean, for the Pact We Made, I do understand intellectually the critique that people have about the ending. I don't think that necessarily detracts from your enjoyment of the novel. I've read plenty of novels and enjoyed them, even if I didn't like the ending. It didn't take away from that experience. But I understand where the critique comes from for the Pact We Made. Having said that, I don't plan my novels. I don't outline them. So I didn't actually know what the ending would be until I approached the ending. And as I got there, 3 possibility spaces opened up for me that could be possible endings. One of them, let's say, would be super passive and super unfeminist, if you want to call it that. And I'm not going to spoil it. I don't want to say. And then maybe the other one would have been uber feminist.
Right.
And then there was a kind of middle path.
Right.
And the middle path felt organic. It felt natural for this character.
Yeah, something that they would do. Yeah.
Yeah, what is a feminist act for one woman is not necessarily a feminist act for another. I think we have to take that into consideration about the particularity of her personhood and her experiences and where she comes from and what makes sense for her. And I think we have to be, you know, a writer has to be true to that, even if it may be problematic. You know, this is the nature, I think, of writing, is you have to be true to that organic feeling of what feels right for your character rather than what some outside party decides is feminist.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's so many shades of feminism, and I think that's what both books do. It's not a one size fits all. There's another question, Layla, that says, what does it mean to write about a woman's body going against the taboos related to it? For example, sexuality, gender, violence, scars, and trauma. So again, it's that question of writing as a woman and writing about a woman's body. I think with both books, we have that.
I don't know the degree that you could separate the two, though, you know, and especially with Silence is a Sense, she's not speaking. And so her silence becomes another sense. So it becomes kind of an extension of her body in a way. And it's one way that she receives information about the world. And it becomes kind of a barrier almost in a way. So, you know, I mean, I think that it's important not to go into your writing with any kind of intentionality about, you know, a message that you want to get across, or an argument that you want to confront or deconstruct. I don't find it helpful to approach my writing in that way. You know, for me, the writing starts with a voice, and that voice is a character, and that character is attached to a body and a history and, you know, a physicality, a sexuality, you know, all of these different facets of that make up who we are. And so I try not to separate any of those things. You know, I try to approach the character as a whole, you know, as a full whole entity, and you know, find expression within that.
Yeah, and I think she's also asking, because what it says is, as a woman writer, to write about the woman's body. So and again, both books really deal with explicit issues that maybe kind of would be not so well received, I guess, in some places. So again, that's the burden of being that Arab writer who has to speak for all women's bodies, I guess. But I'm hoping we answered that, because it says for both Dr. Shahd and Layla, and it's a difficult question. So I kind of put that one on you.
Yeah.
There's a fun one though. Do you have these novels in PDF or ebook format?
I think both of them are available as ebooks. You can check the link that's in the chat, or from the website that we will not name. they might have it as an ebook version, but yeah, they should be available.
I think there's also another question about, again, language. So I think we kind of answered that. Somebody's asking how you came to choose the language that you write in, which is what we actually started the session with. A lot of comments are about how great the book is, and a lot of people are saying congratulations, Layla. I do want to say that because they're really nice comments. I think I kind of want to end with one more general question about your own writing influences. I love asking writers who influences your writing, or who did you read? And you have a thing in both books. You always make sure there's some really nice introduction at the beginning, and you quote from different authors. And I love that. There's something from The Awakening, and then from Hawthorne, and you know, so maybe you can just kind of talk about that for a little while.
Yeah, I mean, you know, there's always so many writers that influence you, you know, and I kind of split my reading time pretty equally between fiction and nonfiction. So, I'll read novels or short stories or poetry or plays alongside nonfiction books, about the various topics that I'm interested in. I think the novel or the novelist that made me want to be an author was Jhumpa Lahiri. And
wow.
yeah, and I fell in love with her short stories first, Interpreter of Maladies, but The Namesake was really the novel that I first read, and I thought, this is what I want to do. I want to make someone feel this way, after they finish reading my book. So she was a huge early influence for me. I also love Camila Shamsi. Her fiction is beautifully rendered. Burnt Shadows, I think, is a phenomenal book. Hilary Mantel, I love her prose style. Han Kang is someone who's a big inspiration for me. And actually her book, Human Acts, is one that I was reading right before I started writing Silence is a Sense. And she writes very short but very punchy works. Quite similar to Adania Shibli. She's a Palestinian novelist who also writes very, very short books, but they pack a punch. And that's kind of what I like. I don't like these sprawling 400 or 500 page epics. You know what I mean? I think like I like it short and punchy, Yeah, short and powerful. Ghada Saman is one of my earliest influences. I think she's sort of like a female Edgar Allan Poe in terms of like using this kind of surreal, supernatural, gothic style. But at the level of the sentence, her sentences are beautiful and they're amazing, even though they're conveying this horror or this catastrophe upon catastrophe. The sentence itself is so beautifully composed, and it has a rhythm to it and a cadence that I find really, really inspiring. And I read her Bil Arabi. But when I was writing Silence is a Sense, it was in the back of my mind where I was like, can I play in this way in English?
Same melody.
A melody, and it has like a cadence that sounds nice when you speak it.
Absolutely agree. I think, there's a lot more questions, but in the interest of time, we'll hand it over back to the center. I think this was also really, really fun. And I think a lot of people are going to be excited to read the books if you haven't read them already. Hope we didn't ruin it too much. I tried to avoid any spoiler alerts, but thank you. I really enjoyed this, Layla. Dana, would you like to?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Layla and Dr. Shahd. We at the Columbia Global Centers Amman appreciate the candor and conversation that you both have contributed to. And the book reading was such a treat. We'd also like to thank everyone who sent in questions and our audience for joining us in our book talk series.